Mark chapter 8. This is a wonderful chapter in the Gospel of Mark in which something very important happens, the declaration of Peter about the identity of Jesus. Now, this chapter starts with an account of Jesus feeding 4,000 people. You may remember that just 2 chapters earlier, Jesus had fed a crowd of 5,000. Well, this is a crowd of 4,000 people. It says that they had been with Jesus for 3 days. They needed to get home. They needed to go back to their homes. And people were coming from all over the countryside to listen to Jesus, to bring their sick. And so they had long journeys back. And we see in this story that Jesus is concerned for the practical needs of people. They don't have enough food to get them back to their home villages and towns. And Jesus feeds, therefore, 4,000 people with a few loaves of bread and with some fish, and they have 7 baskets left over. Now, one of the things we get an indication of from this story is the size of the crowds that came to listen to Jesus. Remember that the previous instance was 5,000 men. Mark specifically says there were 5,000 men in the crowd. And if that were the case, the crowd was probably much, much larger. The men may have, most of them had their wives with them. They could have also had their children with them, so that could have been a crowd of easily of 10 to 15,000 or more. Now, in this story, in the Greek, it doesn't specifically say 4,000 men. It just says there are 4,000 of them, and that yet Mark also may mean 4,000 men, so this could have been a crowd of 8 to 12,000 people. So some indication of the size of the crowds that came to listen to Jesus, and you can imagine that number of people sitting on the hillside and being around Jesus and asking him questions, bringing their sick, and listening to him teach. Well, in the next story, we have the Pharisees asking for a sign from Jesus. It says that they came and they asked for a sign to test him. Now, the Pharisees really are not interested in belief at this point. They're looking for some way to criticize or accuse Jesus. And Jesus says that no sign will be given to this generation. Jesus refuses to do so. Now, we might understand from their point of view how they might have thought this was a legitimate request. After all, if you remember the story of Moses, Moses had given the people signs, or God had given to Moses signs to give to the people. God said to Moses, "Throw down your staff," and his staff had become a serpent. And God said, place your hand in your cloak, and he pulled it out. It was leprous, it was white. He placed it back in, and it was normal again. But Jesus refuses to give to the Pharisees a sign because he knows that they are not truly interested in believing. Well, the next story is a comment by Jesus when the disciples get into the boat. And Jesus says to them, he says, "Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod." Now, the disciples get into this big discussion about food, and Jesus is completely dumbfounded and amazed that they're still worrying about what they're going to eat after the miracle that they have just seen. But Jesus, of course, is not talking about that at all. He is talking about beware of the false teachings of the Pharisees. Well, the Pharisees had gotten off track. They misunderstood the gospel. They were teaching things that were incorrect. So here's a statement by Jesus that reminds us that correct understanding, correct teaching, correct doctrine is very important. And what would have been the yeast of Herod? Well, Herod was the king, he was the ruler, and he had accommodated to secular Roman culture. And it was a warning against accommodating to the culture in which you live. Well, the next story is the curing of a blind man. And there's something very interesting about this story, and that is that it takes 2 touches by Jesus for the man to be able to see clearly. After the first touch, Jesus says to the man, "What can you see?" And he says, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." And Jesus touched him again, laid his hands on him again, and his sight was restored perfectly. Now, this has been an interesting story for people to reflect on, and some people have noted that sometimes we need a second touch from Jesus to be fully and completely healed. It's a reminder to us that our healing does not always happen immediately or instantaneously. It is a process over time, and sometimes we need a second touch and a third touch and maybe a fourth or fifth touch as well. Well, the next story is Peter's declaration about Jesus, and it is really the point to which the gospel has been moving up to this point. Jesus says to the disciples, well, what are you hearing? What are people saying? And they respond, and finally Jesus says to the disciples, well, but who do you say that I am? This, of course, is the question of faith. It is the question of faith to every person, not what does the church believe, what does someone else believe, but what do you believe? Who do you say that I am? Jesus says. And it is Peter who answers for the group. And Peter is in the gospel sometimes saying the wrong thing, sometimes putting his foot into his mouth, but in this instance, he gets it exactly right. He says, you are the Messiah. Now, the word Messiah in the Greek is the Christ. You are the Christ, the anointed one. And Jesus says, it says that Jesus sternly ordered them not to tell anyone. Jesus sternly says, don't tell anyone. So it's interesting here that Jesus is not interested in publicity. He is doing many of his miracles outside of town. He is saying to people, don't tell anyone. And you know, if Jesus had been a charlatan, if Jesus were not who he said he was, he would probably have wanted publicity. He would have been trying to stir up the crowds, get large crowds, create enthusiasm. Jesus is not doing that at all. He is trying to keep the crowds at a minimum so he can teach the disciples and so he can continue his ministry, which is to proclaim the gospel throughout the region, and he is beginning at this point to set his sights on what will happen in Jerusalem. And we see that in this next section. Now that the disciples are clear about who Jesus is, he begins to teach them about his future. It says that he began to teach them that he must be rejected by the elders, he must be killed, and after 3 days rise again. Now, Peter, again, we said he's often putting his foot in his mouth, and this is one of those instances. But Peter has a very natural reaction. Peter says, Lord, Master, don't worry. We're not going to let anything happen to you. We've got your back. We will protect you. And Jesus has a response that must have shocked Peter. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. And Peter must have been completely shocked by that. He thought he was doing exactly the right thing in telling Jesus that they would protect him. It's another reminder that God's ways are often not our ways. What we think is right is not at all what God intends to do. And then it says that he called the crowds along with the disciples, and he began to teach them. And he says to them, if any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. And then this remarkable statement, for those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who will lose their life for my sake and the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit you if you gain the whole world but lose your very life? Well, so that must have been a set of sayings and statements by Jesus that was, again, completely bewildering to the crowds. He's telling them they have to take up their crosses and follow after him. Of course, for us, knowing the end of the story, that it makes complete and perfect sense. There is a cost to discipleship. Jesus' ministry is not simply going to be the way of success and popularity. He is going the way of the cross. And we will see in the next couple of chapters that part of the focus of what Jesus will do with the disciples is to help them understand this, to begin to teach them about this so that when it takes place, they will remember that he had told them beforehand. Well, a wonderful chapter. Go and read Mark chapter 8, and then we will see you in the video for Mark chapter 9.